today's class. So for all the physicians, the number of pages on dialysis treatment in Harrison is quite small. Okay, so just around some 5 pages. So not really worth taking a 2 hour class on 5 pages of Harrison. So I've tried to include some important practical points and points from which questions have been asked previously in this area. So I think even then the class would be somewhere around perhaps 90 minutes or slightly more than that. Okay, so I'll be covering the very basics of dialysis. Okay, the amount at least which every physician should be knowing. For the nephrology preparing guys, this might be very preliminary. Okay, so a very small portion of what they'll be needing to know, but they'll be having elaborate classes during the nephro training program. So yeah, so basically I'll be concentrating on what is given in Harrison and maybe a slightly a bit more of explanation to make it easier for you. Okay, so let's jump into the topic. Yeah, so this has been asked multiple times. So you should be able to tell this answer even without the options. So who is considered the father of hemodialysis?
William
Anyone?
Kolff.
Yeah, so it's quite straightforward. So this is Wilhelm Kolff. He's a German. So all these things are actually important people. Richard Bright is considered the father of nephrology. Oreopoulos, actually, he is no more, and he is considered the father of peritoneal dialysis by some. Okay, but there is some confusion in that area. Anyone knows who's K.S. Chugh? I've told this previously in my classes.
Father of Indian nephrology.
Yeah, commonly credited as father of nephrology in India. Okay, he was a former professor at HOD at PGI Chandigarh, and yeah, very senior man, and he's also no more. And anyone knows about John P. Merrill? So he's the nephrologist who was involved in the first renal transplant, successful renal transplant in the US. And he's also called as father of nephrology by some, father of maybe the modern nephrology by some, because renal transplant is the main reason why many do pursue a career in nephrology nowadays. So maybe, I really don't know, but yeah. Yeah, you were right. It's Wilhelm Kolff. So a short history. So dialysis was discovered by Thomas Graham. Okay, it was way back in the year 1913 when the first artificial kidney was constructed. And this picture is example of the kidney. See, you can see from where we have come to where. So entire bed length was the size of the artificial kidney or the dialyzer. This is actually the dialyzer. Now it's been miniaturized and you can hold it in your hand. So that's how we have progressed. And the first working dialyzer was constructed by Wilhelm Kolff in 1943. So he's been credited with as the father of hemodialysis. And in 1946, Niels Alvall produced the first dialyzer. Okay, and there was another type of dialyzer which is not being used nowadays called the parallel place dialyzer, which was introduced in the year 1948. And in 1960, the counter-current flow and the various techniques of hemodialysis had come into picture. Yeah, so this is Wilhelm Johann Kolff. He is the father of nephrology. I'm sorry, father of hemodialysis. Sorry. So this question has been asked 1,000 times. Even this you'll be able to answer without any options, I'm sure.
Sepsis.
Okay.
CVS.
Read everything and then answer.
Cardiovascular.
Okay, good. Yeah, the answer is cardiovascular. Okay. Yeah, in Indian context, infection is also an important cause, but still, even then, cardiovascular is much more common. So that's why this important thing which is there, right? CKD bar ESRD. So this point I've told even in my first class. Many patients of CKD will die of some cardiovascular complication than reach end-stage renal disease. Okay, so that's how a problem cardiovascular disease is for these CKD patients. So even in patients who are having, let's say, a creatinine of 1.5, 1.6, the EGFR might be low and they're all CKD patients, right? And they all many times would die of a cardiovascular illness. For example, they might have an MI and die rather than the chance of them progressing to ESRD. So that's how common cardiovascular complications are in these patients. The other complications are also very important ones, but they're not the major cause for death in these patients. So the first one is cardiovascular. If cardiovascular is not there, then you can consider infection. Even Harrison's is the same thing. This is just something which you would have been told about in the CKD class. Just to remind you about the stages of CKD. Okay, so the one point I want to stress to every physician, every one of you all who's being trained in medicine, is that don't go by the creatinine values. Okay, always try to calculate the EGFR value. Okay, so that's very important nowadays. You just need an app. Okay, there are so many apps which can calculate EGFR for you. So you might think a creatinine of 1.3, 1.4 is normal, but that might not be the case. Okay, so it's always a good practice, at least in the initial days. Once you become a nephrologist or once you become experienced in this area, even without calculating the EGFR, you'll be able to predict what the EGFR is from the creatinine. Why I'm telling this is, see, many times I find that physicians think a creatinine of 1.6, 1.7 is not that bad. They see a creatinine of 4 or 5, they get very panicky, but they don't get really panicked if they see a creatinine of 1.7, 1.8. But actually, you should be getting more panicked when you see this creatinine, because these patients are the one who will be worsening rapidly. Once you reach a creatinine of 4, 5, there's nothing to do. Okay, many times the EGFR at that time would be always less than 15. So the patient has reached end-stage renal disease by then. Okay, so always try to calculate EGFR. And this classification, I'm sure all of you all know, nothing great over here. The one point you should remember is stage 1 will not be called CKD unless and until you have other markers of renal damage, either some proteinuria or a structural disease. Example of a structural disease, the commonest given example is
Horseshoe-shaped
Polycystic kidney disease.
Yeah, very
Horseshoe-shaped
good. ADPKD.
disease.
Excellent. Yeah. The best example given is ADPKD. So I'll take that. Yeah, even Ashokini, etc. Yes, but most of the textbooks will give you the example of ADPKD. Okay. Yeah, very good. So only if the patients have any of those structural abnormality, they will be classified as CKD. Otherwise, no. Okay. So yeah, this 3A, 3B, and all those stuff you people know. And if less than 15, this is considered as end-stage renal disease. So chronic kidney disease in India. Now, the problem with our country is that we really don't have good data sets. The first paragraph in Harrison deals with data from the US. Very unlikely they'll ask questions from US data for you all. So I thought no point in discussing too much about that. So the chances that you'll get a question on data from India is much more likely. But unfortunately, the true magnitude of the problem in our country is unknown, because there's not been many programs which has collected the data in this area religiously. But we do have some good data from major institutes and a few community driven studies. Okay, but approximately what they say is that the incidence of ESRD in our country is somewhere around 232 per million population, quite high. And almost 2.5 to 3 lakh patients would be needing renal replacement therapy every year. So that's why the government in the past few years has been trying to set up a dialysis center, at least one dialysis center in every district of the country. So yeah, so there's a need for lots of nephrologists and hemodialysis technicians in the near future. And yeah, but the focus should be on prevention rather than the treatment. But yeah, there's nothing much you can do, because at the end of the day, the commonest cause for CKD, all of you all know, is going to be diabetes. And India being the diabetes capital of the world, the number of patients are only going to increase, right? So as you can see, the commonest cause of CKD in our country, in India, is diabetic nephropathy. And unfortunately, because we are not able to capture data properly, the undetermined cause seems to be also very, very common. And next common cause probably is chronic glomerulonephritis, then hypertension. So this is somewhat different from what the international data is. Okay, so hypertension would be much higher up. But again, this is from a paper, a very oft quoted paper from our country. But yeah, most of the time the question asked is commonest cause for CKD. So that is undoubtedly diabetes. Okay. So ESRD around the world, a few lines from Harrison. So it seems that the mortality rate for patients with ESRD is lowest in Europe and Japan, probably because the quality of dialysis over here is really good, especially in a country like Japan, where they have some religious or cultural belief which drives them away from transplant. So transplant doesn't happen in a big way in Japan. So many patients with end-stage renal disease are maintained with renal replacement therapy and predominantly hemodialysis. So they do very good quality hemodialysis. So probably that's the reason why maybe they have the certain things which you are supposed to do, which I'll be talking about. Maybe they're doing that very good, in a very good manner. So that's why they have a low mortality for ESRD patients. Obviously, mortality you expect to be very high in developing world because of limited availability of dialysis. So that's what I told you even previously. Okay. So because the patients are not able to travel for dialysis to the centers, many of them are dying. So that's why the government wants to start more and more dialysis units, at least one per district. And 5-year survival. See, this is the depressing part as a nephrologist, which you always think about. Survival for a end-stage renal disease patient on renal replacement therapy on hemodialysis is around 40%. It's actually much worse than very many cancers. But still, cancer gets so much of the attention, and all these patients get almost no attention at all. But yeah, that's what it is. The survival of, even in the US, it's only around 40%. So it's much worse in our country. And deaths are mainly due to cardiovascular disease and infections. This I had told you all. And some of the important predictors of death. Okay, so this is taken straight from Harrison are old age, male patients, non-black race, interestingly, diabetes mellitus, malnutrition, and underlying heart disease. Okay, so this can be asked as predictors of death in a patient with chronic kidney disease. Old age is quite obvious, and diabetes is also quite obvious. This one seems to be the outlier, the non-black race thing, but yeah, you should be remembering that. So let me see if you're cracking this. Not an indication for starting renal replacement therapy. So see, in my presentation, I'm going to talk about predominantly renal replacement therapy in a end-stage renal disease patient. I'll be just touching upon dialytic therapies in AKI patients towards them. Okay, so this is with regard to end-stage renal disease patient. Which among the following is not an indication?
Anorexia.
Bleeding manifestations.
D and E.
Bleeding manifestations.
D and E. E and E.
D.
This is a PGI style question.
None of the above.
Excellent.
B, D, E.
It's none of the above. All of them are indications for RRT. All these things are there in Harrison. I have not said anything outside what is given in Harrison. Yeah, see, you do consider this refractory hyperkalemia, refractory acidosis, and all those terminologies, but in the broad sense, I am sure you understand what the exams are trying to ask. So in a patient who is having uremia with these complications, you're supposed to be providing RRT for them. So that's a given. The patients are having uremia, you should understand that, okay? So yeah, indications for RRT, I'm sure all of you all know this. It's basically based on the manifestations of azotemia. Okay, it's not the level of azotemia that counts, but the manifestations of azotemia, it really counts. In the tables which I am showing, bleeding manifestations is not there, but Harrison clearly mentions bleeding manifestations. Yeah, in a patient with severe uremia, you can have bleeding manifestations. Okay, it is due to platelet functional deficiency or functional dysfunction. Dysfunction. Okay, sorry. So the indications goes like this. So medically refractory hyperkalemia, medically refractory metabolic acidosis, fluid overload. Okay, so recurrent episodes of fluid overload which are not able to manage with a fluid restriction and with diuretics. Uremic pericarditis. Now, pericardial rub is almost an emergency and you'll have to start dialysis. The only thing you should remember in a pericardial uremic pericarditis is be careful before giving heparin to these patients because in dialysis you usually give heparin. But in a patient with pericardial rub, if you give heparin, they might develop hemopericardium. So you should be a bit careful. And certain other non-specific uremic symptoms. Okay, so that includes anorexia and nausea. So anorexia is there. Impaired nutritional status, drowsiness or sleepiness, decreased energy level, poor attentiveness, worsening cognitive tasking. So this is a better way to remember. Okay, this is more for AKI, but still even you can apply it to ESRD also. So AEIOU. So this you can remember in an easier way. So metabolic, again, this is more so for an AKI picture rather than an ESRD picture, but still it's easier to understand and remember. So that's why I thought I'll put in this as well. So metabolic acidosis, see, it's based on the pH, not on the bicarbonate level. Kindly remember that. And electrolytes, hyperkalemia, severely elevated potassium, where you want to rapidly bring down the potassium levels. So certain intoxication, that's what I said. So this is predominantly for AK. And refractory fluid overload and uremia, neuropathy, decline mental cells. But see, in all these things, I have never talked about the creatinine level or the EGFR level. But I hope you'll understand the patient has a EGFR of less than 10. Okay, so this together with this. So if you have only a ESRD, that is a EGFR less than 15, it doesn't mean you should start the patient on hemodialysis. Okay, you can even monitor the patient if the patient is not having any clinical manifestation of uremia. But invariably, the patients will end up needing dialysis. But the important thing you need to understand is that there is really no benefit in starting dialysis early, because there's been multiple studies, and none of them have shown that starting dialysis early really gives anything more for the patient. Okay, so whether you start the dialysis early or once the patient starts developing the symptoms of uremia, the outcomes doesn't change. So that's why it's better to wait till the patient develops these manifestations of uremia rather than starting dialysis early. I hope I'm clear. So this is a very important point which I want you all to take home. Can you all understand this point?
Yes, sir.
Repeat, sir.
Good. You want me to repeat? Okay. See, it is not the creatinine value or the EGFR which decides when you start a renal replacement therapy or dialysis. Okay. It is the clinical manifestations of uremia. So if the patient is, let's say, having a creatinine of 8, okay, it doesn't mean immediately you should jump ahead and go and do the dialysis. If the patient doesn't have any of these issues, you can even manage them on an OPD basis. Yeah, these patients will need dialysis, but dialysing them now rather than later when they develop symptoms really doesn't make any difference in the outcomes. Okay, this is from well-conducted studies. Okay, so that's why early starting of dialysis just based on EGFR or creatinine values is really not advised. Okay.
Yes.
So now this is a very important slide which I wanted to put because I'm again predominantly talking with physicians. Some of you all will be future nephrologists. See, one of the biggest problem is this. Okay, many times the patient, by the time they come to the nephrologist, they're already in an end-stage renal disease thing, and the day one you see him, you're having to put in a catheter, start a dialysis, or do a fistula, whatever it is. So there's something called as a timely referral to a nephrologist. Okay, so why you should be sending a patient to a nephrologist a bit earlier once the patient's creatinine is starting to increase. Yeah, you might think there's nothing much for them to treat as such. Yeah, that is true. There's still no proven drug which can prevent the progression of CKD only. But still, there are certain other important facts which might be missed or overlooked. Okay, for example, advanced planning and creation of dialysis access. Now, this is something very, very important. There are large number of studies which shows that the mortality is higher in patients for whom you have started dialysis on a temporary catheter. So there's something called as a fistula first initiative. So once the patient reaches CKD 4, once the EGFR falls down below 30, or let's say it's around 20, that range, it's always better to get in a fistula made so that you give some time for the fistula to mature. See, AV fistula which you make, I'm sure all of you know what an AV fistula is. And AV fistula, the day after surgery, you cannot go and prick the vein, right? It takes at least 4 to 8 weeks for it to mature. So you should have made that fistula before so that you can start the dialysis on fistula. So for planning all these access, you better send the patient to the nephrologist. And many times you'll have to teach the patient about the RRT options. So whenever we say RRT, the thing which comes to most of your minds would be hemodialysis, but there's something else as well. There is something called a peritoneal dialysis. Okay, some patients might be very good candidates for peritoneal dialysis, and some candidates might even directly go for a preemptive renal transplant. Now that's even a better option. Okay, so discussing with the patient about all these things, for that you'll have to send the patient to the nephrologist. And vaccinations, that is something which is usually missed in a big way. So there are certain vaccinations which you would like to give to a CKD patient and even an ESRD patient. So especially anyone, what are the 3 main vaccines you are supposed to be giving?
Pneumovac,
Hepatitis B.
influenza.
Hepatitis B. Hepatitis B.
Influenza.
Good. So these 3 are the main. Okay. Very good. So you should make sure that the patients are vaccinated for Hep B, pneumococcal, and influenza. So very good. So how do you give that? Anyone? Hep B, you give double dose. Okay?
Double dose vaccine.
Yeah, so I think that would have been covered. That doesn't come under the dialysis part, so I've not gone into that. But yeah, the only difference is you give double dose, and otherwise it's the same 0, 1, 2, 6. And yeah, pneumococcal usually you give 2. You give the PCV conjugate vaccine and then the PPSV vaccine 8 weeks later. And flu vaccine is a yearly shot. Okay, so but unfortunately in our country, not many take vaccines for pneumococcal and influenza. Again, cost is a big problem. But hepatitis B, yeah, most of them do take, and most of them are already vaccinated for this. The other thing is management of complications of advanced CKD, like refractory hypertension, anemia management, acidosis management, and secondary hyperthyroidism management. So probably this can be done better by a nephrologist. So these are the only reasons why early referral to a nephrologist might be of great help, more so for the first 2 points than any other thing. And as I told you, this is the line which I was discussing in the previous slide as well. There is no real benefit of initiating dialysis preemptively at a GFR of 10 to 14 compared to initiating HD for symptoms of uremia. So this is what I was explaining. And this exact line is there in Harrison. So this is a very, very important clinical point which you all should know. So yeah, so as physicians, we should never jump to a conclusion that dialysis is the treatment whenever the patient is having high creatinine. It's not that simple. So this is something a very, very important picture. Yeah, you all know about all these options, but yeah, it's presented in an interesting way. So any patient with end-stage renal disease, what are the RRT options they have? I told you the one thing which comes to your mind immediately would be hemodialysis, but it's not just hemodialysis. There are other options as well. Okay. So you need to discuss with the patient. So it is a combined decision. Many times the patient and the nephrologist and the various other stakeholders in our country, especially the relatives, you need to sit with them and decide what is best for the patient. Okay. So you have hemodialysis, you have peritoneal dialysis, and you have kidney transplant. And importantly, one other treatment which many of us forget is comfort care. Okay. So you can have you can shift between the two. It's not that once the patient goes in for hemodialysis, that's it. He should be on hemodialysis. He can go for peritoneal dialysis. The patient who's on peritoneal dialysis can shift to hemodialysis. And once they're started on hemodialysis or peritoneal dialysis, they can be searching for a donor, and then eventually they can go in for a kidney transplant. Patients who have a transplant, a donor upfront can go for a preemptive kidney transplant. So all these things can go on. And there are certain frail patients, some patients who might not be good candidates for RRT. So as doctors, you need to understand that not all patients might be good candidates for hemodialysis, peritoneal dialysis, or transplant. Let us say you have an elderly, a 75-year-old with multiple comorbidities, having a diabetes, some cardiac issue, and all those things. It might be better to treat him with medically rather than put him through all these things. So you need to discuss all these things with the patient. So that is called as a comfort care. Many patients do opt for that as well. Okay, but understand and remember, age alone is not a criteria for comfort care. It's not. It doesn't work like that. Okay, age is just one of the factors. Okay, so it doesn't mean that every elderly cannot undergo dialysis. Not like that. I have patients of 80 plus who are on dialysis. Okay, it depends on multiple other things, comorbidities, lifestyle factors, etc., etc. So you should take all those things into consideration and have an open discussion with the patient, and then decide what is best for the patient. So yeah, just explaining a bit more on the previous slide. So in dialysis, you have hemodialysis and peritoneal dialysis. In hemodialysis, the most commonly preferred mode of RRT worldwide. Anyone?
3 per week HD.
Yeah, so that's what is highlighted over here. So worldwide, the commonest form of RRT practiced is in-center HD. So what do you mean by in-center HD is that the patient comes to the hospital or to the hemodialysis center and gets the dialysis done over there. Home HD in our country is almost not existent. Very, very few might be having home HD, but I really don't know. I've not seen any home HD in our country, at least. I don't have any patients. So you can give short daily nocturnal dialysis. Okay, so that's also an option. In peritoneal dialysis, you have manual CAPD and a cycler used or automated peritoneal dialysis. So what is that? I'll be saying a few words to you also, don't worry. So that can be done in the home. So see, for example, one of my teachers, he used to be the prime nephrologist for Jammu and Kashmir. So for patients in, let's say, Ladakh, see, it's very difficult for them to travel for getting a HD done. So twice in a week, how will you come to a HD center? In winter and all, there'll be no access at all. So such patients should be managed with only some home treatment method, right? So such patients are all usually on peritoneal dialysis. Okay, so yeah. So for patients who are having this difficulty, they don't have any nearby HD center, and they don't really, or even if they have a HD center, they don't wish to change their lifestyle in a big way, peritoneal dialysis is a very good option. So there are certain issues. What are that we'll be discussing. So what is the difference, prime difference between PD and HD? See, efficacy wise, one doesn't score over the other. Though HD, in HD, the solute removal is much more efficient. Okay. In PD, it is a slow, continuous process. Okay. But there are no very good trials comparing the two, but outcome wise, there's really not much of a difference. but usually it comes down to cost. Okay, in our country, this is a practical point apart from your entrance point. Practically, it comes down to cost. So in some states, like for example, I'm practicing in Tamil Nadu. So there is some government schemes for hemodialysis, but peritoneal dialysis, the schemes are not that robust. So many times HT might be given free of cost for from the government schemes, but peritoneal dialysis really doesn't have that much support. So there are not many takers for peritoneal dialysis. That's a very big drawback. But there are certain countries. Anyone knows the country which follows PD in a very big way? Anyone?
New
Read in
Zealand.
newspapers. I'm not sure. I don't know about New Zealand, but I know about Thailand. Okay, so Thailand as a country, they have a very strict PD first policy. Okay, so the patients are put on PD, and if the PD there are some contraindications or doesn't work, only then they can shift for HT. So as a country, they have a policy like that. Okay, it's very difficult to enforce such things in a country, but yeah, Thailand is one country which I know has a PD first policy. And this point is very, very important. So the decision of hemodialysis with peritoneal dialysis, it's based on personal preferences and quality of life consideration more so than really scientific decision making, because outcome wise is really not much of a difference between the two. So it comes down to the personal preferences of the patient and the treating nephrologist, and as well as quality of life consideration. Okay, so some basics. Okay, again, there's one small para in Harrison about this. Which among the following is not a principle of hemodialysis? Very easy. This even an MBBS student should be able to pick up.
Radiation.
D.
Yeah. So such questions are common for MD entrance, not for DM entrance, but anyway. So yeah, all of us know about the principle of diffusion. Okay. So this picture just shows that it's the movement of solutes from an area of higher to a lower concentration. Though it looks very elementary, school level maybe, but it's very important to understand this. And in dialysis, this happens across a semi-permeable membrane. Okay, so a selected diffusion process happens. Okay, and ultrafiltration. Again, this is one thing which some of y'all might not be really understanding. So many times you see a nephrologist order, there are some 4 or 5 things which he writes in a hemodialysis order. He usually writes the duration, the access which is to be used for the dialysis, and the amount of fluid to be removed. Okay, that is usually written as UF. Okay, so the movement of fluid through a membrane caused by a pressure gradient. Okay, so previously it was concentration gradient, and now ultrafiltration is through a pressure gradient. So at one side you have a higher pressure, the other side you have a lower pressure, or one side you have a negative pressure, the other side you have a positive pressure. So this results in the movement of fluid. Okay, and this is called as ultrafiltration. So this is used in a big way for the removal of excess fluids in dialysis patients. And closely related is convection. Okay, so this is called as the solvent drag. When you give this pressure and this water is being pushed, some amount of solutes are also getting pulled together with this fluid. So this is called as solvent drag, and the principle is called as convection. Okay, so these three are the major principles which is involved in the hemodialysis, which are supposed to be knowing. So this is a very, very important question. So let me see how many of you are answering. So what do you think is the amount of water a HT patient is exposed to in a single session of HT?
120 liters.
120 liters.
So all of you have read Harrison, so it's quite straightforward. But yeah, this has been asked, and this is quite important. Yeah, but see, it's quite a mind-boggling thing, right? Yeah, after I've read, but if you think about it, see how much of water a single session of dialysis is needed for one patient. Okay, so and this needs to be extremely good quality. Okay, so dialysis is a big burden on the environment as well, because you need such large volumes of water, and because the patient is exposed and his blood is directly exposed to such high levels, right? So this water needs to be of an exacting quality. Okay, so it needs to be of the highest quality. So I'll say a few words about water treatment plan, then I'll explain. So just continuing with the HT principle, the rate of the diffusive transport depends on these factors. Okay, so I told you diffusion is from a higher concentration to lower concentration. So the magnitude of difference, so one side if it's higher and the other side is much lower, then the transport is going to be higher. the membrane surface area, as you would expect. The higher the surface area, higher is the transport. And there's something called as MTAC, mass transfer area coefficient, or mass transfer coefficient of the membrane. That is the membrane which you use to make the dialyzer. So it depends on the porosity, that is the size of the pores and the thickness of the membrane and all those things. Okay, so based on these factors, the diffusive transport occurs. Urea is much smaller. Okay, it is just 60 Daltons when compared to creatinine. So that's why urea clearance is much better than creatinine clearance. So best way for you to understand this, after first session of dialysis, if you see, urea reduction is much more drastic and dramatic than the reduction in creatinine levels. So that is because of this very reason, because of the size difference in the two. The other way of remembering this, I don't know how many of you all have managed peritoneal dialysis patient. Any of you all have managed CAPD patients?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
So have you ever seen a creatinine of less than 5-6 in a CAPD patient?
No.
No.
Yeah, almost never. Okay, unless an AK. In end-stage renal disease patients who are on CAPD, the creatinine level is always above 8. Okay, but urea level will be low. It will be some 70, 80, something like that. But creatinine level is always high. So this is the reason. Okay, creatinine is much larger than urea, and that's the reason. So yeah, dialyzer. I'm sure all of you all have seen a dialyzer. This is what a dialyzer looks like. So if you take a cross section, so it has these multiple fibers. Okay, so this is a cross section showing these fibers. So you have blood going within the fibers and dialysate flowing outside the fibers. And usually the flow is in a counter current way. Okay, so the direction of blood flow is opposite to the direction of the dialysate flow. And this helps in increasing the gradient. Okay, so see, you can see this over here. Here the concentration is higher, but as it goes off, this lower concentration comes here over here. So the concentration gradient is maintained. So efficiency is improved. So that's why they use this counter current flow. And yeah, again, for the nephrology training people, you need to know about what this fiber is and all those things. But in general, it is nowadays it's usually made of polysulfones. Okay, so if you remember that much, it's more than enough. The hollow fiber dialyzer is made of biocompatible polysulfone. Okay, previously they had used cellulose and all those things. Okay, so there were lots of issue of dialyzer reaction, etc., etc. But nowadays that's all not even available in market. So very unlikely you'll be ever questioned on that. And the important thing, so how many of you all know that this dialyzer is usually reused? Anyone is aware of that?
Yes, sir.
So when I was
Yes,
so when I was
sir.
oh, you all know.
Yes,
So I think many of you all have been exposed to a dialysis unit. So when I was a undergrad, or when I was doing my early postgraduate days, I really didn't know this fact. But yeah, especially in patients who are see, many times in AK patients, many centers don't really reuse the dialyzer, but end-stage renal disease patients who are on dialysis, many times it's reused. Okay, so that's where the problem comes. So that's where you have to follow the universal precautions and all those stuff. So even now, many centers do isolate HCV patients, Hep B patients, and non-HIV patients. Okay, so I'm sure all of you are aware of this, but the international guidelines really don't suggest such separation. Okay, they say you follow the universal precautions, you should be fine. But even the best centers, they would always prefer to separate HCV patients from the non-HCV patients and Hep B patients also. Okay, so yeah, because there is a chance of transmission. And HCV is one infection which can rampantly spread within end-stage renal disease patients if you don't follow proper precautions. Okay. And how do you test these patients for HCV? Anyone? It's a very important question, though it's not there in Harrison.
Titers, HCV RNA titers.
Yeah, very good. So it's not just
Anti-HCV.
no, it's not just the antibody. So that's why I exactly asked this. Many times the antibody levels might not be positive, and still the patient can be having HCV RNA. Okay, so that's why what most centers across the country they do is, for an end-stage renal disease patient, if he's been on dialysis with a particular center for a prolonged period of time, let us say more than a month, and now he's changing centers, they would do a viral markers. Okay, they will see anti-HCV, Hep B, HBsAg, HIV, and all those things. If in those tests anti-HCV is positive, then well and good. Okay, you treat them as chronic hepatitis C. But even if it is negative, many dialysis centers would insist on a HCV RNA level. Okay, so that is very important. Why? because the patient can be in a window period and you can miss those patients. And if you miss those patients and you're reusing your dialyzer, you'll be in trouble. Your entire patient pool can get infected. So that's why most of our center, for example, in our center, what we do is, if we have a new patient, we will be doing this LFT and the viral markers. And if the patient has been on dialysis the previous outside center for more than a month, then we get a HCV RNA done. Until the HCV RNA report comes, we don't reuse the dialyzer. Okay, so this is what we do. Most of the centers do this only. Okay, and there are certain guidelines or etc. for this. Okay, you can go through that, but again, not very important for exam. And talking about this reuse of dialyzer, now what are the agents which are used for dialysis? So this can be asked. So peroxytic acid, formaldehyde, glutaraldehyde, and bleach. So these are the commonly used ones. Peroxytic acid is the one which mostly of them use. This is called as Renalin. It's a brand name, but anyway, if they ask in exams, it will be peroxytic acid, hydrogen peroxide. So this is used to clean the dialyzer and then reuse. Okay, so the number of reuse, it varies. Okay, so every center has its own policy, but many centers they reuse up to 8 to 10 times. Okay, it depends on the quality of the dialyzer and if there's any damage, etc., etc. So you have to look into that. But yeah, you can reuse up to 8 to 10 times, and some companies say you can reuse even up to 20 times. So it varies. So the other component of a hemodialysis. So we have seen about the dialyzer. So other thing which you need to know about would be the dialysate. Okay, so one side is the blood, the other side is the dialysate, right? So I'm sure all of you have seen the patient will be carrying a can, okay, and one powder. Okay, so that's called part A, part B. Okay, part A is the acid concentrate and part B is the bicarbonate powder. And this is the concentration. Okay, and usually the proportioning is done by the dialysis machine. So these lines are all from Harrison, and some important points you need to know about the dialysate. See, usually the potassium concentration in the dialysate is very low, for obvious reasons, because ESRD patients, they don't have any means of excreting potassium from the body and they're all hyperkalemic, right? So the dialysate should be having a lower concentration of potassium for you to lose potassium. But previously, zero potassium dialysate and all was being used. Even now it's available, but most nephrologists don't use zero dialysate potassium nowadays because of the rapid reduction in potassium. And such rapid reduction in potassium makes the patient prone for arrhythmias. Yeah, you can lose patients to VF and all those things. So you will almost never see any patient using, any nephrologist using zero potassium dialysate nowadays. Okay. And yeah, the calcium concentration, again, it can be variable, but it's usually around 2.5. What are the uses and disadvantages of high and low things I'll be telling in the next slide. And sodium concentration, now that is very important. In a patient who's having a frequent intradialytic hypotension, that is, who are having frequent fall in blood pressure during dialysis, it might be a good practice to maintain their sodium at a higher level. We do something called as sodium profiling and all those things. But the disadvantage of this technique is that these patients are all having increased thirst because they are having a net positive balance of sodium. So they'll be having increased thirst and they'll be coming with volume overload. Okay, so you need to be careful. And this is the question I had asked. Okay, so every patient is exposed to such huge volumes of water. So what is this machine? Anyone?
HD machine.
HD machine.
No, this is definitely not a CRRT machine.
HD machine.
Yeah. But can you see how many this thing is there? So you want to refine your answer?
This is a mobile unit.
Okay, so think about it. Yeah, this is a HD machine, but I wanted a bit more from you all. So this is a bit of a newer generation HD machine, but yeah, what it is, we'll be seeing. Nowadays, many big centers are all using this machine. Okay, they're not using the older machine. Yeah, good. Yeah, exactly. So we'll see about that towards then. Yeah, so this is a very important point. Again, more so for the nephrology crowd, but
activated charcoal.
Yeah, so very good. But again, I think this is the one who answers are all nephrology people. I'm sure the non-nephrology training crowd will not be knowing all these things. But anyway, this is a very important question for them. Chloramines. Okay, see, you know, most of the municipal water is all chlorinated, right? But chlorine is the biggest villain for the RO plant, because chloramine is something which can damage the RO membrane. Okay, and the RO membrane is the costliest part of a water treatment plant. So among the following, which is used to remove chloramine, so it is the carbon filter. So just a simplified diagram of a water treatment plant for hemodialysis. So how many of you have seen the water treatment plant in your dialysis unit, in your hospital, if you have been to a dialysis unit? Any of you all? So usually you have this big drum-like
Yes,
things,
sir.
you know. Yeah. So this is the bare minimum. Okay, a simple water treatment plant for hemodialysis. So usually you have the source water, okay, which could be municipal water or groundwater or whatever, and you have a reservoir tank where by sedimentation all these large particulate problems are all gone. Then you have a particulate filter, you have a water softener, okay. Brine is that concentrated saline solution. You have the carbon filter where chloramine removal happens, and you have some places have a deionizer also. Then it goes into a RO membrane. This is the reverse osmosis plant. This is the big machine which you have. And what do you think? See, let us say you send 10 liters of water into the RO plant. How much water do you think will be coming out as pure water? How much do you think is what? How much water do you think is wasted? Just a guess.
1 to 2 liters out of 10.
Oh, very good. Oh, I am surprised. I thought all these RO membranes when I was very young. I used to think that wastage won't be much, but you're right. Actually, around only 1 or 2 liters of water would be of good quality. So you can see how much of water is being wasted for single session of dialysis for a single patient. See, that's the amount of water you are needing. But you're right, yeah. So a very small amount of water has come out as a useful one. The rest is all wasted, and unfortunately, that cannot be used for any good purpose. Also, that water many times just goes for waste. That is for restroom and all those stuff. It's not a quality water which you can use for anything else. So see how much water is needed. So this is a table from again all the nephrology people will be knowing, a book called Fihali. Okay, so again, because Harrison had talked about the sodium thingy, I thought I'd just show about what about the others also. So Harrison has talked about what happens when the dialysate sodium concentration is increased or decreased. So if you increase the dialysate sodium concentration, you have better hemodynamic stability, but the disadvantage is thirst. This is what I was telling you. So because of this thirst, the patient can come with volume overload and high blood pressure. So if you decrease the dialysate sodium levels, the patient can be having reduced osmotic stress, but then again intradialytic hemodynamic instability. The patient will be at a high risk for hypotension. Potassium increase. So see, many times for patients, for cardiac patients, so let us say a patient has had a recent cardiac event, we add potassium to the part A. This is done many times because we don't want this patient to be prone for intradialytic hypokalemias, because these patients are all very much prone for arrhythmias. So we used to add potassium to the acid concentrate. So this is quite common. Yeah, we want to keep the patient's potassium at around 4.55. We don't want it to go below 4. So that's why we used to do that. But for patients with high dietary potassium intake and many ESRD patients, you need to maintain the potassium at a lower level. So usually we use potassium 2 concentrate bath is used. Again, same for increasing and decreasing calcium. So if you increase the calcium, then it suppresses PTH, and maybe you need not really give oral calcium supplements to these patients. But what do you think is the latest recommendation on calcium for ESRD patients? Anyone? Again, this would have been covered in CKD. Would you prefer giving oral calcium to a patient who is having end-stage renal disease with and the cause being diabetes? Would you want to give? You don't want to give?
No.
Very quiet.
Vascular calcification risk is there.
Excellent. So you don't want to give, right? So that's exactly the question I asked. So you, unless and until patient is hypocalcemic, you don't give calcium supplements to a end-stage renal disease patient, especially if the cause for the end-stage renal disease is diabetes, because these patients are at an unacceptably high risk for vascular calcification, especially coronary calcification, increasing their, worsening their cardiovascular risk. Already these patients are at a high risk for cardiovascular complications, and if this is going to be worsening, then they will be at a higher risk. Okay, so nowadays the recommendation is to avoid calcium as much as possible. So this all comes down to the one point, that is many times calcium is used as a phosphate binder. So that's why nowadays the push is to use non-calcium binders like Sevelamer and all those things. But unfortunately, again, this is my personal opinion, I don't find these drugs very effective. But anyway, this is theory. And coming to bicarbonate, yeah, many dialysate baths have a higher bicarbonate concentration because these patients are all acidotic. And many times post dialysis, if you take an ABGNC, they'll all be alkalotic because the bath bicarbonate concentration is quite high. Okay. And yeah, how many of you all knew that the acid concentrate contains glucose as well? Okay, so you need to know this. It was there in the previous picture. I don't know whether you saw that. Yeah, if you see over here. Okay, I've not put the glucose concentration over here. So this is acetate. So some baths use acetate as well. But yeah, there's a small concentration of glucose in the dialysate. So anyone knows what this number means for a nephrologist? Okay, for a HT machine. A very weird looking number, isn't it? 1:1.72 is to 42.28.
The proportion
yeah,
of part A, B,
Yes,
and water.
water.
Okay. So I'm talking to a very, very knowledgeable crowd.
B, A, and water.
Which do you think is the answer? Yeah, you're right. Just for others to understand. So this is basically
B.
a proportionating system.
B.
No, see, it's very simple. Once you know the concept, the answer should be very easy. The maximum portion is going to be water, right?
What is
Yes.
ABW?
It is ABW.
ABW.
It is ABW. See, this is acid, base, and water. See, you need not know so much, okay? But anyway, I thought I'll just put in a different question. I told you, the dialysate is something which is prepared by the machine, right? The HT machine takes from the acid concentrate, from the base concentrate, and from the water and creates the final dialysate. That proportionating system has a ratio. There are two ratios which are commonly used by the machines, and this is one such ratio. Okay, so ABW is acid, base, and water. And obviously, in the concentration, water would be the maximum, right? So with that, you can easily pick this up. It's not difficult. So coming to the blood delivery system. So we have seen about the dialysate, we have seen about the dialyzer, and now we are coming to the blood delivery system. Okay, so this is basically the extracorporeal circuit. Okay, so you have the dialysis access, whatever it is. From there, the blood is coming out, and something is happening at the level of the dialyzer, and then it goes back into the patient. So this process involves the tubings. We call this the HT tubings or the dialysis tubings, the blood pump, which is a part of the HT machine, and the dialysis solution delivery system and safety monitor. So these are all parts of the HT machine. Okay, so the blood pump actually moves blood from the patient to the dialyzer and then back to the patient. And for a proper dialysis, the blood flow pump speed is usually between 250 to 450, but in our country, almost none of the access will be good enough for a 450 flow. So if you want to do an adequate dialysis, a good number for the blood flow would be 300 ml per minute. Okay, so yeah, you can see, you can imagine in a minute, almost 300 ml of blood is removed from the patient for a good proper dialysis to happen. And ultrafiltration, as I told you, is done by manipulating the pressure difference between the blood compartment and the dialysate compartment. Okay, and yeah, each membrane, the dialyzer, the manufacturer does give you the range, how much of pressure difference the membrane can withstand, and there are various alarm systems. When these set limits are crossed, the alarm systems can go off. They say TMP alarm and all those things. Okay, and the dialysis solution delivery system. This is what I was telling. Dilutes the concentrated dialysate with water and monitors these things. Conductivity is the sodium concentration, basically most of the time. The temperature and the dialysate flow. So these are all the parameters which you enter into the dialysis machine, and the dialysis machine does this. Okay, the human work is not there in much, and the ratio given down are two different ratios. One which I had shown, the other one is the second number. You need not really remember these numbers, but yeah, I remember those numbers because this was the question asked to me in my final DM exam. Okay, but anyway, but usually it's not very important. Yeah, so this is a picture given in Harrison. So you have an arterial line, and so this was another misconception I had as a undergrad or a physician. So I thought if arterial line, they'll be pricking the artery, and if the venous line, they'll be pricking the vein. So that's not the case. Okay, so what you mean by the arterial line is that the line through which blood comes out of the patient, and venous line is the line through which blood enters the patient. Okay, so both the pricks are made at the vein only. Am I clear? I mean, but I think most of you all know all these things.
Yes,
all of you all are very people who know all these things already.
No.
But anyway, for the non-nephrology crowd, this point. Okay, so both the arterial prick and the venous prick are made in the vein only. So arterial line doesn't mean you go and prick the artery. Okay, so I had this misconception, so I'm just making that clear. Oh, so some of you are there like me, so I'm very happy now. So it's called arterial line because it's away from the patient. That's all. See, the definition of artery and vein is that anything which goes away from the heart is called artery, and anything which comes towards the heart is called as vein. That's all. Okay. So an arterial line, venous line, in both the prick is in the vein only. If it's an AV fistula, in a vascular cannula also, see, you put the cannula inside the vein only. No, you don't put one cannula inside the artery and one inside the vein. No, right? So the limb through which blood comes out of the patient is called the arterial limb. The limb through which the blood enters the patient is called the venous limb. Okay, that's all.
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, this is the arterial line, and this is the. See, again, the pictures also confuse you. No, for the arterial line they give you a red color, and for venous line they give you a blue color. So you think, okay, the artery is being picked. It's not like that. It's just that the venous line actually has the pure blood, and the arterial line has the impure blood, something like that. And this
So,
is the
so
dialysis
both of
machine.
the blood
Okay.
will mix together.
Yeah, that will happen. No. So there's something called as recirculation and all those things. Let's not go into that much of depth. So even if it gets mixed, you are removing the impurities. No, so the concentration will definitely go down. Okay, and it's not a single cycle. The cycle is happening. Okay, it is a 4-hour cycle, right? Am I clear?
Yeah, yes, sir.
Something, nothing great. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
So this is a dialysis machine, right? So this is what the proportioning system is all about. So you have the acid concentrate, you have the bibag. So sometimes it's not the bicarbonate powder. There's something called as bibag. Most of the modern machines use bibag. It is basically concentrated bicarbonate and water. So based on the proportioning, you get the dialysate. So this is the dialysate flow. So this is the dialyzer, and this is the dialysate flow. And the spent dialysate goes down the dialysate drain. And you have various monitors, okay, which measures the pressure difference and any air which can enter and all those stuff, and can give alarms. Okay, you need not go into so much of depth. And the one thing over here, so this is the same thing. You have a arterial, so the blood goes out through the arterial limb, through the dialyzer, and comes out through the venous limb and enters the patient. And yeah, the pressure is negative on the arterial side. So then only the blood can be sucked, right? So you have a pressure monitor, and yeah, you give heparin before it enters the dialyzer so that the blood doesn't clot. So this is a very important question. So which among the following is the best initial vascular access for HD? So this is for ESRD patient, remember. All of these things are vascular access for HD. Among them, which is the first best initial?
ECC or Permacath?
Non-dominant breccia.
C.
So I
Distal
confuse
AVF.
you. Yeah,
Distal
so that's a good
AVF.
answer. Yeah, but there are two answers with distal AVF over
Or
here.
B.
B.
So it's not RB.
B.
Non-dominant breccia.
Yeah. So you always see this. See, remember one thing. If in end-stage renal disease, axis of choice is always AV fistula. Understood? Point number 1. Point number 2. Distal AV fistulas are better than proximal AV fistulas. Point number 3. Non-dominant arm AV fistulas are better than dominant arm AV fistulas. This is all. Okay. So in the options, if you have something which fulfills all these 3, go for it. So here the only difference was Bessio semina is the other name for radiocephalic fistula. If you know that, you would have picked this up. So AV graft, it's not an AV fistula, so it's out of question. Permcath, again, it's not an AV fistula, so it's out of question. So it should be among these 3 things. So now, distal AV fistula, yes, it's good, but this is in a dominant arm. You have a non-dominant arm and a distal fistula, so this becomes the best answer. Okay. So just for y'all to understand these 3 concepts, I'd put this question. But usually they won't confuse y'all so much. It will be AV fistula, AV graft, temporary catheter, Permcath. The answer would be AV fistula. Okay. So now going on to the most important part of hemodialysis. Okay. So the most important thing which we should understand is the vascular access. So that's why the vascular access is otherwise called the Achilles heel of hemodialysis. Okay. So if you have no vascular access, there's no hemodialysis. So that's how important it is. So what is the vascular access? So in this picture, you can see all these 3 things. An AV fistula. So it is a connection between artery and a vein. AV graft, you have a tube or a plastic tube which connects the artery and the vein, and a temporary catheter. Okay. So basically, a vascular access is something which provides a location for easy access to the patient's blood for dialysis. Okay, and this is the biggest problem for that's why it's called Achilles heel of hemodialysis. And some of the important complications or issues with vascular access would be stenosis and thrombosis in the long term. And the life of the patient depends upon the vascular access. See, it's as simple as that. So any hemodialysis patient, his fistula stops functioning, all nephrologists become very worried. Okay, because it's life or death thing for the patient. If he loses his fistula, many times the patient might lose his life. Okay, so that's how important vascular access is for HD. And yeah, you should be properly monitoring the vascular access every time. So there are many things for that, but we need not go into the depth. I'll just tell a few words about each vascular access. So AV fistula means, so a vein is cut and connected with the artery. So many times the patient thinks there's some machine which is kept inside. So many times my patient come and tell me after they've undergone a transplant or something, sir, please remove this machine. So there's no machine over there. Yeah, as doctors, they all would be knowing. But many times the patient think that thrill which they get now, they think there's some machine which is running over there. It's not like that. It's just a vein which is connected with the artery. And AV fistula, basically, you just arterialize the vein. Your vein becomes big enough so that you can easily prick the vein. So that's all is the concept of AV fistula. So many times it can be end to side or side to side. And the high pressure flow dilates and thickens the vein. Okay, so and it is the best access. Okay, so it has the lowest infectious risk, and so that's why it's considered the best access. Okay, and it is long lasting with the least possibilities of a thrombosis. And drawbacks, now this is the biggest issue. It usually takes 2 to 4 months to mature. So this is why I told you access planning is a very big part of nephrology, and patient needs to be referred early to a nephrologist so that they can really decide on access and all those things, right? And the second point is even more important. So even with all your expertise, if you have made a fistula, only around 50% of them might mature. And this is a bigger problem if you have an elderly patient or a diabetic patient with poor veins. Okay, so you need to plan vascular access as early as possible. So this is what I'm trying to explain, and try to make a AV fistula as early as possible. And many times, even if the AV fistula is made by the senior most vascular surgeons, it might not work. Okay, and if without AV fistula, many times doing dialysis might become very difficult. Coming on to AV graft. So there are some patients for whom you will never be able to make AV fistula, because especially in diabetics, elderly, obese females, the veins might be too thin and they might not be good candidates for AV fistula. Then you can consider an AV graft. Okay, so this is basically a tube made of a biocompatible material. Okay, so here you can see, so this is the thing. You attach one end to the artery and other end to the vein, and you can trick this plastic thing. So many times it's made up of PTFE, polytetrafluoroethylene material. Okay, and but again, whenever you put in a foreign material, they are not as good as the God-made vessels. Okay, so there are lots of disadvantages, and very few centers would prefer an AV graft. But in the US, I think AV graft is used in a bigger way. But in our country, very few centers really prefer an AV graft. Okay, so if you're able to get an AV fistula, always try for it. But if you don't have AV fistula, then you might consider an AV graft. But AV graft is definitely better than the next option.
Sir.
So, yeah.
Sir, instead of that, like what is it?
PTFE, polytetrafluoroethylene.
Instead of that, why can't we use saphenous or something like that for graft?
No. It really won't work, because it won't mature and it just doesn't work. It won't. See, the biggest advantage of AV graft or AV fistula is that you can prick this immediately. AV fistula will never be able to prick immediately, and the thickening of all those veins, etc., almost doesn't happen. Arterialization, etc., doesn't happen. Has all been tried, but they don't help.
Okay.
And see, moreover, you are preferring graft because the patient doesn't have a good vein, no? So if the patient had a good vein, why would you do a graft? You would do a AV fistula itself.
No, for like radiocephalic vein you told, so that cephalic vein is not available, you can take saphenous vein graft, no, for that.
Many times see, this vascular problem is usually generalized. It's not usually restricted to the arm alone. That's why it said very clearly the problem usually
Okay,
happens in elderly diabetics. Okay, so it's not that their upper limb veins are bad, but the lower limb veins are good. Usually, it doesn't work like that. So if the vessels are bad, it's bad everywhere.
Okay, sir.
That's why many
Thanks.
times, even in if you go for CABG and all those things, they use internal mammary artery rather than the saphenous vein. But anyway, let's not go too much into the depth of that. So this is a very important question. So among the following, I'm sorry.
How do we choose in between the two?
I'm not able to hear you properly. Maybe you can send to me in chat. I'll try to answer that later. Your voice is not clear. Yeah. So among the following, which vessel you would not prefer for HT catheter? Now, this is very important. Let me see how many of you will answer this.
Left subclavian. Left subclavian.
Right
Femoral.
subclavian.
That's all. I put it
left
in
subclavian.
bracket, no. So there is more than one.
B and C.
Very good. B and C. Yeah. Always, if you have subclavian as an answer, go for that. Okay. Subclavian is the worst possible access for HT catheter you can have because of the very, very high unacceptable risk of stenosis. Yeah, you would not prefer femoral also, but for a short term, yeah, you can consider femoral, but never subclavian. So coming to the temporary catheters, so this one is something which all of you all would have seen. Okay, whatever is shown in the picture is a tunneled catheter. I told you we are going to be discussing predominantly about ESRD patient, not about EKA patients. So that's why I'm showing tunneled catheters. The recommendation is end-stage renal disease patient should not be leaving hospital with a non-tunneled catheter in place. But unfortunately, in our country, almost every patient will be only going on that because again, cost is a big problem. Tunnel catheter costs somewhere around 30 to 40,000 rupees, but non-tunnel catheter costs somewhere around 4,000 rupees. So no patient wants to go for a tunnel catheter. Yeah, so many times it happens like that. Not only in our country, even in the US, the patients don't come in time for a AV fistula to be made earlier. So you are left with putting in a temporary catheter to start dialysis. And the biggest problem, as you would have known, is infection, right? So if you have not followed the asymptomatic precautions to the T, almost every patient will develop infection. And if you have a clinical suspicion of infection, if it's a temporary catheter, the recommendation is to just remove it. Okay, if it's a permanent catheter, that is, if it's a tunneled catheter, then you can consider to salvage it. You can try to salvage it, but if you have any metastatic infection or tunnel tract infection, etc., then you'll have to remove it. Okay, so this is what the recommendation is regarding catheter infection. Okay. So yeah, some important vascular access guidelines. Okay, so this is something which is very important. So this, I'm sure in your residency days, your seniors might have told you all. If you have a CKD patient, try not to prick the cubital veins for drawing the bloods and all those things. Okay, you always try to take it from the dorsum and try to put the IV line over that, if at all it's possible, as much as possible. That is, you need to preserve the veins. At least one hand should be left for AV fistula so that you don't damage the veins in that arm. Maybe you can use the right hand, something like that, and avoid the subclavian vein as much as possible. Okay, because it is associated with a very, very unacceptable risk of stenosis. Okay, so this is again a purely theory question. If you have read Harrison, you should be able to answer this. So how do you evaluate dialysis adequacy?
KT by V.
Only that?
Urea reduction ratio.
URR. A, B, and D.
All of the.
Dialysis adequacy, D is not there. Okay, clinical features, etc. are there, but usually it's URR and KT by V only. Okay, dry weight as a concept, again, the nephrology people would be knowing. So it helps you to decide on how much of fluid you want to remove during each session of HT. Okay, but yeah, it doesn't really picture in the dialysis adequacy part. Again, you need not know too much about this KT by V and URR. Even the most trained nephrologists are not experts in that area, but you need to understand some basics, because Harrison, just I think 2 lines are there about that. So just for your MCQ purposes, I'll tell a few things about that. So I told you the goals of dialysis, the blood flow rate is usually around 250 to 450. So this depends on the axis. Okay, there's something called as rule of 6. Again, the nephrologist people will be knowing that. So the AV fistula needs to have a very good blood flow. Recommendation is to have 600, but none of the AV fistula will be really having that good blood flows. And it should be thick. It should be at least 6 millimeter thick and less than 6 millimeter length from distance from the skin. All these things. So this is called a rule of 6 for a good AV fistula. Okay. Again, that's not very important because it's not the Harrison. I'm not going into the depths of that. And you remember this. See, for the blood flow of 250 to 450, the dialysate flow is usually 500 to 800. Okay. So as you increase the flow rate, the efficiency of dialysis increases. I told you, in counter current. So higher the flow, more would be the concentration difference, more would be the dialysis happening. And yeah, so the efficiency of the HD is determined by the blood flow and the dialyzer characteristics. This is what was that about that mass transfer coefficient I was talking about. So the dose of dialysis it depends on the patient size. So obviously for bigger patients, you'll be giving bigger dialysis, longer duration maybe. And it also depends on the residual kidney function. So there are some patients who will be having good urine output, especially the tubular interstitial disorder patients. The urine output would be adequate. So for them, they might be able to get away with even twice weekly dialysis. But patients who have become anuric would definitely need thrice weekly dialysis. And yeah, protein intake. So patients who are taking very high protein would be needing a more frequent dialysis. And degree of anabolism or catabolism and the presence of comorbid conditions. So these are the things which decides the dose of dialysis. And this KT/V concept and this urea reduction concept was developed after this paper by this legendary duo called Sargent and Gauge. So they decided on delivery of delivered dialysis dose. See, many times you would have said, let us say 4 hours you have said, but there might be some downtime. That is because of some vascular issues, the patient might not have got what you asked for. So now the adequacy is decided based on the delivered dose. That is the amount of dialysis the patient received. So that's why the adequacy was shifted from the duration of dialysis which you're doing to what is actually happening to the patient because of the dialysis. Okay, so that's what this delivered dialysis dose concept means about. And yeah, the adequacy of dialysis is based on the fraction removed of urea reduction. So that is another one thing, URR, urea reduction ratio. So you would see a pre-dialysis urea and the post-dialysis urea and see how much has decreased, and based on that you would decide on the delivered dose. But there have been some very many good international trials which have shown that even you might think that if you remove more urea, the patient will do better, but that doesn't seem to be happening according to studies at least. So this is the target. So this is from Harrison. So the KT/V you are supposed to be targeting is 1.2. From where did this number come? What does this number mean? It's very difficult to explain in this forum, but you just remember this number, it's more than enough. Okay. And a urea reduction ratio which you want to target is 65 to 70%. And for most patients, this is important. They will need 9 to 12 hours of ST per week. So that's why many places they give 4 hours of dialysis session 3 times a week. But if you see in our country, many places they'll be doing only 2 times a week for various reasons, patient-related factor, hospital-related factor, and all those things. But the recommendation is at least 12 hours. But in our country, many places they're doing only 8 hours. And if the patient is having good urine output, that is, they have some amount of residual renal function, they'll be able to get away with this 8 hours. But if they have no residual renal function, that is, they have no urine output, etc., then it will be difficult for them. So there are other factors also like adequacy of ultrafiltration. So that's why someone answered body weight and all those things. But they are also important, but they don't come under the, you cannot have set levels for that. And there are certain other trials like the frequent hemodialysis network study where they compared daily dialysis with this intermittent dialysis. But again, though there were some improvement in certain parameters like LV mass and health related quality of life, it didn't really bring about a change in the mortality and all those things. So that's why it doesn't score over in-center dialysis. So if a patient is having a low KT/V, that is, they have let us say a poor quality dialysis, how can you improve the qualities of dialysis? So this is what this flowchart shows. So you have to be optimizing the blood flow. Okay, maybe change the dialyzer. You can increase the duration of dialysis. You can increase the rate of dialysate flow. Okay, sometimes you can also ask the patient to do intra-dialytic exercise and all those things. So, okay, you need not go into so much of a depth, but yeah, these are some of the methods you can use. or the final Brahmastra would be to increase the frequency of dialysis. So if the patient is on thrice weekly dialysis, you can make it four sessions of dialysis per week and all those things. So these are some of the ways in which you can increase the dose of dialysis or increase the improve the dialysis quality. So what are the goals of hemodialysis? So basically, you want the patient to be free of uremic symptoms. Okay, not only uremic symptoms but also volume control. So this is the most important fact. But what do you think is the most important advice you should be giving to a patient who's on dialysis? Most important advice, if you have to give one thing.
Weight gain to monitor weight.
Interdialytic weight gain.
Very good, excellent. So fluid restriction. So that's what you're supposed to be telling. Okay. So you should be advising them on fluid restriction. So that is the biggest problem which all these patients would be facing. So that's why this second thing, controlling volume overload. Okay. The rest and all can be taken care of by hemodialysis. Okay. And yeah, so this can be evaluated by using KT/V and URR. So this is the thing which I told you earlier also, right? So there doesn't seem to be a much difference between starting dialysis early or starting it late. So this is the biggest problem. So that's why many centers, they would start dialysis only if the patient is having uremic symptoms, not based on some preset EGFR level. So which among the following is the commonest complication of HT? Again, this is very simple.
E.
Hypotension.
Hypertension.
Yeah, all of them are complications of HT, but the commonest one among them is hypotension. So yeah, Harrison has a one paragraph on hypotension. So it is the most common acute complication of hemodialysis. Okay, it is almost always due to excessive ultrafiltration. Okay, so many times you blindly put how much fluid is to be removed from the patient based on the weight gain. That's not the way it should be done. But anyway, yeah. So that is one of the main reasons why patient develops hypotension. And many of these patients are all having this autonomic dysfunction. I told you these are all diabetic patients. They might be having some autonomic neuropathy and all those issues. So that is one thing, and they're all cardiac patients. So if you have a poor cardiac reserve, then again you're at a very high risk for hypertension. I'll show a picture later that will help you understand. And this dry weight concept is what I was telling even previously. So this is the minimal weight at which the patient has no symptoms of volume overload or hypotension. So, okay, that is the weight which you are supposed to be targeting. And you can remove this fluid by something called as ultrafiltration modeling. That is, you remove more amount of fluid towards the initial part of the dialysis and smaller amount of fluid towards the later part. And the recommendation is that if you're going to be removing more than 13 ml per kg per hour, the patient will be having some trouble. So if you see like that, let us say a 60 kg person, so per hour you should not be removing more than 700 ml, rough number. So in 4 hours, you should not be removing more than 2.8 liters, but many of your patients will be removing some 4 liters. So whenever you're removing such large amounts, the patient will be at a very high risk for cardiovascular issues, okay, including sudden cardiovascular death. Okay. So how do you treat hypotension? So many times just stopping the ultrafiltration would do. Sometimes you might have to give a small amount of fluid bolus also. Some other techniques which you can use during dialysis would be like cooling the dialysate, because the cooling the dialysis leads on to vasoconstriction. Okay. And that can help in improving the BP. A head down position can help in lessening the symptoms of the patient. Or you can do something called as a sequential ultrafiltration followed by hemodialysis. These are all techniques. And avoiding heavy meals during dialysis, because what happens is if the patient takes a heavy meal during dialysis, the blood flow gets directed towards the GI tract and that results in hypotension. So you should ask the patient to avoid taking heavy meals during dialysis. And yeah, pharmacological treatment seems to be midodrine, which is an alpha agonist. Yeah, so nowadays we are getting midodrine in the market, so you can use that for some patients. So what are the various other complications? So one other complication is the patients commonly complain is muscle cramps. Again, the cause seems to be excessive ultrafiltration. Okay, so it might be because of some changes in muscle perfusion, because of excessive rapid volume removal. And the treatment is again to decrease the ultrafiltration rate and do something called as a sodium modeling. There are a few drugs which many people try, but actually they are not recommended, like carnitine and all those stuff, but they really don't have much of a role. And there's something called as dialyzer reactions. Okay, so because see again, because the blood is coming directly in contact with a foreign object, there might be some allergic responses. It can be of two types, type A and type B. Type A is anaphylactic, okay, so it is IgE mediated, and type B is actually the anaphylactoid one. Okay, so many times it's because of cytokine release and all those things. So this is just a picture showing one other important complication, which is seizure. So there are so many causes for seizure, but one of the commonest things is dialysis disequilibrium. So what happens is that this happens very commonly during the initial sessions of dialysis. So let us say a patient comes to you with end-stage renal disease, a urea of some 400 and a creatinine of some 30. So many times you see the nephrologist the first dialysis is always a shorter session and it's a very ineffective dialysis session they give. So this is to prevent this, okay? Because a rapid fall in urea can lead on to something called as a dialysis disequilibrium syndrome and the patient can develop seizures, okay? So that's why the first session of dialysis in a highly uremic patient is always a short session, ineffective dialysis, so that the fall in urea is not very dramatic, okay? So this, if you have noticed the orders from a nephrologist, you would have seen. A patient who's come to the casualty with a urea of 400, many times they'll start dialysis slowly. So that's for this reason. So this is the picture I was telling about. So if the patient is having good cardiovascular reserve, so this is the intravascular volume. If the reserve is good, then the patient is able to adapt in a better way. So this is as you increase the amount of fluid being removed, initial symptom would be feeling uneasy, then cramps, and then hypotension. So that is towards the lower end of the spectrum. And similarly, the other way around. So when it's increasing, initially you'll develop hypertension. If you don't do anything, then it'll go for heart failure, and then the patient will go for pulmonary edema. Now, in a patient who's having impaired cardiovascular regulation, which most of the patients who are CKD will be having, so this cushion is lost. Okay, so they will be developing these issues at a much earlier stage. Okay, so they can go in for myocardial stenting, cerebral symptoms, and hypotension. So that's why doing HT for a patient with cardiac comorbidity is quite difficult, okay? And you should be very wary. So that's what this picture shows. Okay. So what are the various other complications? So this is not mentioned in a big way in Harrison, but yeah, one of the most important things you should know is catheter-related complications. So you can develop complications during insertion of the catheter. Okay, many times I'm sure you would have seen carotid puncture, pneumothorax, and all those stuff. Okay, apart from that, you can have infection, thrombosis, and bleeding. I've told you how you handle infection. Then you can have access-related issue in a patient with CKD. That is, the access can go for thrombosis. You can have a pseudoaneurysm with rupture of the AV fistula. All these things are very difficult to handle, but yeah, these things can happen. And hypotension, hypovolemia, we've already talked about. Muscle cramps, we've talked about. Dialysis reaction, I've already told you. Even hypertension can happen. Okay, that's very important, especially for patients who are having this positive sodium balance. Hypertension can happen, and many patients in our country, they'll come to the dialysis unit without taking antihypertensives. Okay, so that is also one other reason. And air embolism, yeah, because there is a negative pressure, air can get sucked in. Usually you have alarm systems which should prevent this, but we have seen air embolism. Anyone, what is the typical murmur you get in air embolism? That question is asked often. In a patient.
Churning.
Yeah, churning murmur. There's some other name, no? Is it called churning murmur? Yeah, millwheel. Yeah.
Millwheel.
This is what I remember. I remember this millwheel thing only. Yeah, so that's been asked. So what is this thing? So this is again for the non-nephrology people. Nephrology people will be knowing this. No one seems to be answering. What is this machine?
Plasmapheresis.
Plasmapheresis. Oh my God. I thought everyone would know what this is. Okay, I'll tell at the end. This is a CRRT machine, but okay. Okay, so we are going into PD now. Oh, it's taken so long. Oh, I thought okay, still we have quite a bit of class left. But anyway, what is the type of peritoneal dialysis shown in the diagram? Anyone? Preparing for nephrology. Okay, this is CAPD, continuous ambulatory peritoneal dialysis. I'll show what it is. Okay, so coming to PD. Okay, so in HT you had a dialyzer. In peritoneal dialysis, the peritoneal membrane is your dialyzer. Okay, so I'm sure you all know about this. You have a peritoneal membrane. The patient is there. You let in a dialysate. You let it to dwell inside the peritoneal cavity for some time, and after some time you let it out. So the exchange happens between the capillaries in the peritoneum and the dialysate which is there in the peritoneal cavity, and all the impurities drained out from the abdominal cavity by this route. Okay, yeah, so this is it. So your peritoneal membrane acts as the dialyzer. This is the capillary where you have all these impurities. The filtrate, diffusion, convection, and all those things again comes into picture. Okay, and the important thing over here, see here you cannot apply a pressure. Okay, what you did in dialysis, you cannot do over here. That's why this is not as efficient as the HT. But the osmotic gradient is brought about by the use of glucose. The dialysate fluid which so the dialysate fluid usually has this glucose. Okay, so based on the concentration of the glucose, the osmotic gradient varies, and that is what helps in drawing out the fluid from the blood. And there's something called the 3-pore model of the peritoneal membrane. Okay, so the peritoneal membrane anatomy, if you see, it has some very small pores through which water is going, then some small pores and large pores through which the larger membranes transfer. Okay. So this is some pictures which can help you understand how we prescribe PD for a patient. Okay. So continuous PD. So when you are doing PD throughout the day, okay, it is called as a continuous PD. So this is the dwell. That is, let us say this is the 24-hour period. Okay, the patient is exchanging 3 times in the day and once in the night. Okay, so totally 4 exchanges. Usually the recommendation to do 3 to 4 exchanges. So 3 exchanges in the day and 1 long dwell in the night. Okay, so this is how a CAPD works. Sometimes the patient, what they can do is, you can do multiple exchanges in the night using a cycler. Okay, it is a machine, APD, is automated PD. The machine does the exchanges. Okay, manually if you do using gravity and you yourself, I mean the patient himself or the attender hangs and does it, it's called as a manual PD. When the machine does these exchanges, it's called as a cycler PD or automated PD. So you can use a machine to do multiple exchanges in the night, and in the daytime you keep one fluid in the peritoneal cavity throughout the whole day. Okay, so this is called as a CCPD, and there are certain variations as well. So some patients might not want to do any dialysis in the night, so they have only a day only PD. Some patients don't keep anything in the day and they do multiple exchanges in the night only using a cycler. Okay, so you can have these variations in peritoneal dialysis. So this is an important question. So among the following, which peritoneal dialysis fluid gives the best ultrafiltration? This is not in Harrison, but this word is mentioned. One line is there. Okay, see, higher the concentration of dextrose, better is the ultrafiltration.
Icodextrin.
Yeah, the answer is icodextrin. Okay, so icodextrin is actually a polymer. Okay, it is not, see, whenever the problem with giving too much of dextrose is it gets absorbed into the system, and many of these patients are diabetics, I told you. So the glycemic control goes haywire. So you really don't want to be giving them so much of glucose. But you remember like this, higher the concentration of dextrose in the PD fluid, higher would be the ultrafiltration. Icodextrin is actually a disaccharide. It's actually a maltose based thingy, but it is not metabolized in the body. Okay, and it is usually 7.5%. Okay, it's not dextrose, but 7.5%. So remember like that. That's why icodextrin has the best ultrafiltration. So peritoneal dialysis.
Sir, what is E? What is E? PD4 fluid.
Okay. Okay, so that is it's again a trademark. So it's from a company called Baxter. Okay, so it has low calcium. It is one of the things which Baxter has been introduced recently. PD4 fluid. It has low calcium PD dialysate. Okay, so the Baxter company name for these things is Dianil. This is called Extranil. Okay, these are brand names. Usually you don't use brand names in such scientific discussions, so that's why I've not used it. PD fluid is actually a brand name. So it is a low calcium peritoneal fluid. Okay, slightly low calcium. And there are certain biocompatible fluids also, but again, all those things are not important. Okay, we'll go on to the technique of PD. Okay, so usually the volume which is instilled is somewhere around 2 liters. Okay, per session, per cycle for most of the Indians, but you can go up to 3 liters also. And as I told you, it is the tonicity of the PD solutions which drives solute and fluid removal. Okay, so varying concentrations of glucose can be used, right, from 1.5 to 4.5%. And as I told, icodextrin is the non-absorbable carbohydrate that can be used in place of dextrose. And this line is there in Harrison. That's why this question was asked. So ultrafiltration is better with icodextrin than dextrose. Okay, and I told you, so this is the typical last fill for CCPD patients or the long dwell for CAPD patients. So that is, I'm sorry. So in the picture I had shown you, see this long dwell, no, many times we use icodextrin, this long dwell, because icodextrin you keep for longer duration, you'll have a better ultrafiltration. Okay, so that's what this line means. And there are certain additives to PD fluid. Okay, so sometimes you might have to add heparin when the patient have this fibrin strands and all those things. In patients with periperitonitis, you can even give antibiotics in the peritoneal route. And some people do add insulin, but usually we don't advise patient to give these additives because the chance of infection is very high. If the patients don't do this adding these things to the PD fluid in a sterile manner, the chance of infection is very high. So we really don't recommend these things. So to access the peritoneal cavity, you need a PD catheter. So just like a vascular access, you have a PD catheter. So the one which commonly used is the swan neck or the straight two cuff. So this other is called the Tenkopf catheter. Okay. So some centers also use this coiled catheter. So it depends on the center, but most of the centers use either this swan neck two cuff or the straight one with two cuffs. Okay. In our center, we use the swan neck thingy. And usually there are these two Dacron cuffs. This causes scarring. Okay, the one cuff is kept in the preperitoneal space and the other is in the subcutaneous tunnel. And because it induces scarring, and this fibrous tissue prevents the migration of the commensal bacteria from the skin to the inside the peritoneal cavity. Okay, so that's why these cuffs are there. And usually the recommendation is to place them 2 centimeters from the skin and in the peritoneal plane. So when one is, so if the skin is over here, this should be around 2 centimeters from the skin, and this is usually kept in the preperitoneal space. So many times it is placed by a surgeon, but yeah, nephrologists are also trained to do this. So this is the way in which the nephrologists do it. So this is called as by using the Seldinger technique. There are many techniques. So this is using a peritonioscope. So you use a needle, you prick, and you make sure that you are inside the peritoneal cavity by using a peritonioscope. Okay, then you use a peel away sheath and a dilator and put in the catheter. Okay, some of you all might have seen how a PD catheter is inserted. This is not going to come in your exams, but yeah, nephrologists can also insert PD. Okay, but yeah, the best method would be to do it laparoscopically with the help of a surgeon. But yeah, nephrologists also can insert PD catheters. So there's coming to the just like how the membranes, that is the dialyzer membranes we have seen, depending on the thickness, the porosity, the size of the pores, the quality of the dialyzer can vary. So based on the patient's peritoneal membrane characteristics also, they have been classified as either high transporters, low transporters, average transporters. So among these high transporters, what are the features? So Harrison has 2 lines on this. So I've asked a question from that. So what are the features of high transporters? If you know that, you can answer this. At least the nephrology crowd, can you all give me the answer?
D.
So I'll give you. Yeah, very good. Very good. Yeah, D. If the answer is D, so only one is right. Yeah. So usually D by P and D by D0 are opposite. Okay. So what do you mean by D by P is that it is the concentration of D by B creatinine should be there. I'm sorry, I forgot the creatinine. So this is for dextrose. So the concentration of creatinine in the dextrose to the concentration of, I'm sorry, in the dialysate to the concentration of creatinine in the plasma. So usually in high transporters, this equilibration happens very fast. So that's why they call it high transporters. And the opposite happens with the dextrose. So the dextrose, which is in the dilysate, rapidly enters into the patient's blood. So the concentration of dextrose in the dilysate goes down very rapidly. So usually high transporters have a low D by D0, okay, and have a high D by P. So that's the outlier. All the others are features. Okay, high transporters have a rapid absorption of glucose, leading on to the loss of osmotic gradient and resulting in poor ultrafiltration if you keep the fluid for a longer time. So that's what the second line is all about. And they tend to lose more albumin, so they become malnourished very easily. So how do you find this? How do you know about whether the patient is having a high is a high transporter or a low transporter? So you do something called as a peritoneal equilibrium test. Okay, so you put in the dialysate into the peritoneal cavity and you measure certain things. Okay, and based on that you can classify the patient. Okay, they can be classified as either low average, high average, and high transporters. Okay, the high transporters, they have rapid equilibration. I'll show a next picture, you'll understand better. Okay, so because I told you the important factor determining ultrafiltration peritoneal dialysis is the concentration of glucose in the dialysate. So if the dextrose concentration goes down rapidly, there will be no fluid transfer at all. So ultrafiltration will not be happening at all. So because in high transporters, this glucose concentration is lost rapidly because of rapid transfer of glucose from the dialysate into the patient's body, they have poor ultrafiltration, okay, especially with long dwells, and they lose more albumin also. So that's why if you have high transporters, you should be giving them short dwell times with frequent cycles. So that's why high transporters are many times good candidates for automated peritoneal dialysis or cycler peritoneal dialysis, but not for manual peritoneal dialysis. In low transporters, the problem is they will have good ultrafiltration with long times, but their solute clearance is very poor. The creatinine won't be going down rapidly. The urea won't be decreasing rapidly. So that is the problem with low transporters. Okay, but most of the patients are usually average transporters. Okay, and one other way to increase the efficacy of peritoneal dialysis would be to increase the PD fluid volume. So instead of putting 1 liter, if you put 2 liters, the outcomes, the clearance is better. If you put 3 liters, it's even better. But again, if you put 3 liters of fluid into in a small sized patient, he'll feel very uncomfortable. Okay, so you should think about that also. So this is the picture I was telling about. So you need not really remember this. This is how a peritoneal equilibration test is done. Okay, and this is how you classify patients as low average, high, and high average. If you see, so this is D by P creatinine. So D by P creatinine, when the value is greater than 0.8, it's called as high. When the value is less than 0.4, it's called as low. And the same thing is opposite for D by D0, because I told you, rapid increase in creatinine volume in the dialysate and rapid fall in glucose value in the dialysate favors a high transporter. Remember this line alone. Okay, but again, you not remember so much in depth. But if you know this much, I will be very happy. And this is a very beautiful picture. Okay, so this is again for the nephrology crowd also. So if you remember this one picture, entire PD is over. So you can see in this picture very, very beautifully. See, for a rapid transporter, the rise in the creatinine concentration in the dialysate happens rapidly, but it's very soon plateaus off. For a slow transporter, this rise in the creatinine concentration in the dialysate is slowly progressive throughout. When it comes to ultrafiltration, that is, for a rapid transporter, it increases, but because the glucose concentration goes down rapidly, after some time, the patient goes into negative territory. But for a slow transporter, it slowly rises. Okay. And when you divide these two things, that is called as the creatinine clearance per exchange. So for rapid transporter, if you keep the fluid for more than 4 hours, you're going to be in trouble. But for slow transporter, if you're going to keep the dwell time for less than 3 hours, you're going to be in trouble. I'm sure many of these things, what I told might be Greek and Latin for you, is just for you all to understand one point. You have to try to target this peak. Okay. So for a rapid transporter, this peak is somewhere around 2 to 3 hours. So shorter dwell time is needed. But for a slow transporter, you might have to give a slightly longer dwell time. This is all. If you remember this much, it's more than enough. So if you have diagnosed a patient as a rapid transporter, your PD regimen should be shorter dwell time with multiple cycles. So that is best done using a cycler. So that's why patients who are all high transporters are all good candidates for automated peritoneal dialysis or cycler PD rather than CAPD. So one other important use of peritoneal equilibrium test is to evaluate the patient for ultrafiltration failure. So what do you mean by ultrafiltration failure? So if you have seen any PD patients at all, they will all be maintaining one diary. So they'll be writing how much of fluid excess has come out in each session and all those things. So some patients, the ultrafiltration in PD might not be very good. So how do you evaluate for this? So for that, you can use the peritoneal equilibrium test. So there are various things, but I want you all to remember only this thing. Type 2 membrane failure is otherwise called as peritoneal fibrosis, and type 1 is due to peritonitis. Okay, so based on the D by P creatinine, the patient can have various causes. Again, I'm not going to go into the depths of this thing. There's one question which will come from this, that is the complications of PD. At that slide, I'll explain this. Okay. Okay, so let me see who's answering this. The most important factor for successful PD.
Good PD access.
Residual renal function.
No one is answering. Good nephrologist.
Good PD.
Yeah, you're right.
Yes.
Rest definitely C. Okay, that is the most important thing. Okay. Just for my happiness, some of you would have said good nephrologist, man. But yeah, it doesn't matter. Okay, the most important thing is residual renal function. If you remember this point, this question has been asked multiple times. Like vascular access is the Achilles heel of hemodialysis. Residual renal function is the Achilles heel of peritoneal dialysis. Patients who are not having any urine output, they usually don't do well on PD. Remember like this. Okay. So patients are having, so that's why CTAD patients do well on peritoneal dialysis. Okay, something like that. Because ultrafiltration is the one component which you cannot manipulate in PD. In HD, you can dial into the machine how much fluid you want to remove. But in PD, you really cannot determine that exactly. Yeah, there are techniques to increase ultrafiltration, but exact amount of ultrafiltration you will be able to achieve is something which you cannot set in PD. So that's why the problem is. Okay, so coming to peritoneal dialysis adequacy, again, this is a very much a gray area. Even many nephrologists are not very well versed in this, but this one line is what I want you all to remember. Residual renal function is very, very important for peritoneal dialysis, more so for peritoneal dialysis than for hemodialysis. And rates of technique failure increase with years on dialysis. Okay, and as the patient continues to be on PD, many times they start losing the residual renal functions, and they may have to be shifted to HD if they're having no chance of transplant. Okay, anyone? What is this machine? Anyone? The name of the machine is written over there, but I don't know. If you have not seen, you'll not be able to answer. Anyone has been ever posted in blood bank, gone to blood bank and seen what is happening over there or anything like that? Okay, so that was the clue. Okay. Okay, I'll tell what this machine is towards the end. Yeah, this is a plasma exchange machine, but yeah, very good. So how do you define PD peritonitis, the biggest problem of peritoneal dialysis? What is the definition of PD peritonitis? So what, I mean, TLC, that is, this is the total count, and this is neutrophilia. So what is the answer?
More than 100.
D. 100, more than 100 is 50% neutrophils.
Yeah, right. That's D. Very good. So this can be asked. This has been asked multiple times. So if you see the cutoff, it's much lower than for SBP. This is because peritoneal dialysate fluid contains glucose. So whenever you have glucose, the bacteria can multiply rapidly. So that's why even if you have small amount of TLC, you should be very careful. So the complications of PD can be classified as either infection related, non-infection related. The major one is infection related. You can have something called as an exit site infection or a tunnel site infection or PD peritonitis. And the non-infectious complications can be catheter related, that is due to the PD catheter, or non-PD catheter related. Okay, so the various complications are given over here, but the important ones are given over here. You can have a pericatheter leak, a hernia, a poor glycemic control, or some malnourishment. So malnourishment is predominantly because of albumin loss. So PD peritonitis. So this is the biggest problem which many patients fear, and even the nephrologists fear. So this is mainly due to technique issues. Okay, if the patients in a hurry or for some reason they don't do it using the proper sterile technique, they will be in trouble. They will develop PD peritonitis. Okay, and as I told you, because it's a dextrose-based solution, the cutoffs are quite low. Okay, and the patients usually come with these complaints. They have abdominal pain, they can have fever, and the common thing which they say is cloudy effluent. Okay, so the PD fluid which is being drained will look cloudy. Okay, so if that is there, it's most likely to be PD peritonitis. And as you would suspect, the commonest organisms are all the gram-positive cocci, especially the ones which reside in the skin, like Staph epidermidis, the cons, and Staph aureus. You can also have gram-negative ROS, and then some patients are having recurrent episodes. Fungal or TB also is there. So when the patient has this fungal peritonitis, etc., you might have to remove the catheter and put in a new one also. So that's also important. And treatment is many times IP antibiotics. So the patient can be managed at home if the episode is really mild, but severe ones might need hospital admission. I've seen many patients coming with sepsis and septic shock because of PD peritonitis, and such patients really don't do well unless until you remove the PD catheter and maybe manage the patient for temporarily with hemodialysis as per need. Okay. So this is just a small flow chart. Okay, so and this is a picture showing exit site infection. You can see the catheter. You can see the catheter all exposed, and you can see the skin really totally excoriated, red, and all those things, right? So this is a severe example of a severe exit site infection. Okay, and whenever you have a clinical suspicion of peritonitis, you first check the dialysate for white blood cell count. Okay, if it is greater than 100, then yeah, you get in a gram stain, and you better commence empirical antibiotics and send a culture. And based on culture report, you modify your IP antibiotics. Okay. Many times you usually give ceftazidime or for gram negative, and for gram positive you can give vancomycin. Even gentamicin can be used, but again, think of residual renal function and use antibiotics appropriately. And if you grow multiple organisms, always think of a surgical cause. Okay, it can be a perforation or something like that. Then you might have to do a laparotomy, get a surgeon's help, and even do a catheter removal. So whenever you get more than 2 organisms grown from the PD fluid, be very careful. And what are some other complications of peritoneal dialysis? Yeah, you can have metabolic complications. Okay, so I told you high transporters especially have significant albumin loss. Even low transporters have albumin loss. So that's why PD patients are recommended to take a higher level of protein. Okay, so if it is 1 gram per kg, usually for them it is 1.2 to 1.4 gram per kg because of this constant loss. And because they are always exposed to high concentration of dextrose, they are always having this hyperglycemia, and weight gain is something which is a big problem for them. And you can have these catheter related problems. Okay, just like in the vascular access, you can have momental wrap, poor outflow, and all those issues. So you should be a bit careful and look into that as well. And this is the most dreaded complication, but not very common. Something called as encapsulating sclerosing peritonitis. This can happen with patients who are on long-term peritoneal dialysis, and it's the cause for that type 2 ultrafiltration failure, which I was telling about. So this is a picture showing that. See, you can see all the peritoneum getting calcified and thickened. So it's just not working. The filter is all gone. Okay, and ultrafiltration failure is again a very big problem. So there are various techniques you can use to manage ultrafiltration failure, like using icodextrin, increasing the number of exchanges, increasing the PD fluid volume, and then there are various evaluation techniques as well. And one other cause would be if you have let us say some pores in the diaphragm through which the fluid gets leaked into the pleural cavity. All these things have been seen. Okay, so you have to work up the patient for ultrafiltration failure. So this is an important question. Again, it's not discussed in Harrison, but I just show a table. So which among the following is an absolute contraindication for peritoneal dialysis?
Efficient.
D.
Yeah, the answer is A. Okay, it's an abdominal wall stoma. All the others are relative contraindications. So this is again taken from Fihali. Okay, contraindication to dialysis modalities. Absolute contraindication. Okay, so if you have severe adhesions, obviously you cannot do it. And if you have a surgically uncorrectable abdominal hernia, again very important, because all your PD fluid will be escaping into that uncorrected hernia, and you won't be able to do proper peritoneal dialysis. If you have a stoma, for obvious reasons, your fluid will all leak out. If you have a diaphragmatic fluid leak, okay, and again, this is a social issue. Relative ones include a recent abdominal aortic graft, VP shunt. Some patients won't be able to tolerate this increased amount of fluid in the abdomen. Morbid obesity, okay, and severe malnutrition, skin infection for obvious difficulties in placing the catheter, bowel disease. So some of these are some of the relative contraindications to peritoneal dialysis.
What is abdominal stoma?
What happened?
What is abdominal stoma?
The stoma, okay, it's a surgery when you have this colostomy and all those things. Ileostomy, colostomy, and all those things. When the patient has undergone a recent abdominal surgery with those stomas, that's what it means. And relative
Sir, why only VP shunt are relative contraindications, sir?
Why do you want it to be an absolute contraindication?
There is shunt is there.
No, but it's actually a sterile catheter only, no? The VP shunt usually has no communication with the exterior at all. It is from the CSF into the abdominal cavity. So that's why it is a relative contraindication. It's not an absolute contraindication. But such combinations you will very rarely see. A patient needing VP shunt going in for PD is something very uncommon, right? So relative contraindications to hemodialysis. Again, see, in hemodialysis, everything will be based on the vascular access. If you have no vascular access, you cannot do hemodialysis. As simple as that. And relative contraindication would be if you have a difficult access. That's all. And the others are severe cardiac failure. See, I told you, hypotension. If the patient is having significant hypotension, you won't be able to do hemodialysis at all. Okay, so then these patients, especially patients with amyloidosis. So there'll be some patients with amyloidosis, end-stage renal disease. Managing such patients is a real difficult scenario. The BP will be always somewhere around 90-60. You cannot do hemodialysis for them. For all of them, you'll have to do only peritoneal dialysis. Okay, so that's what this cardiac failure, that point is there. So this is a very important slide. Okay, so this is what I was talking to you all about also. Sometimes no dialysis might also be considered as a treatment. Okay, so how do you go about that? Okay, so if the patient is unable to cooperate, okay, so for some whatever reasons, or having a terminal illness, okay, and especially very old patients, there are some recommendations which they say. So if the clinician's response of no to the question, would you be surprised if the patient died within the next 6 months? So if you feel the patient's, outcomes are not very good, just like cancer, if the performance status is very poor, you might really not be starting dialysis for them because it won't really help. So this is what I said, not only age, but the other things, multiple comorbidities, and if they have very poor functional status and very severe chronic malnutrition, such patients, really providing dialysis to them won't make any much of a difference. So you need to have a good conversation with the patient and their caregivers and take an appropriate decision. So what are the long-term outcomes of end-stage renal disease? See, as I told, cardiovascular disease is the major cause for death. Okay, and many patients will have vascular calcification and chronic inflammation. And the role of statins in ESRD is a bit iffy. Some trials like 4D and Aurora really didn't show much of a mortality outcome. That is, the LDL cholesterol concentration may go down, but there's no reduction in death or CV events. But certain other trials like the SHARP trial did show some benefit. Okay, but so you give statins if the patient is having dyslipidemia. Otherwise, just for some cardioprotective activity, giving statins is really not recommended. And you have to follow the conventional cardioprotective therapies. Okay, the various other complications of ESRD include infection, progressive debility, frailty, protein energy malnutrition, and impaired cognition. And cognition is one important problem. So long-term HP patients, many of them might be having impaired cognition. So a few words about this. What is this? Read this fully. What is this called?
Techno.
A
No.
CRRT.
Applied for 24 hours a day. Yeah, this is
CRRT.
CRRT.
Yeah. So read it fully, no? Yeah. So this is the definition of CRRT. So continuous renal replacement therapy. Again, it's for AKI, and two main. See, again, there's absolutely, if you might not believe, there's absolutely no papers which suggest that CRRT is better than HD in any way. There are only two major indications. If the patient is having intracranial hypertension or hypotension, the main important thing is hypotension. On supports, you might not be able to do hemodialysis, and for such patients, you might consider CRRT. Okay, because here the fluid removal rate is much slower. I told you in HD you remove around 250 to 400 ml per minute. In CRRT, you can even go up to 20 to 50 ml per minute. Okay, so because you're removing so small amount of blood, the chance of hypotension might be lower. Okay, so that's where CRRT is used for patients who are having severe hypotension and AKI, multi-organ dysfunction in an ICU setup. There you might consider CRRT. It's an extracorporeal blood purification therapy intended to substitute for impaired renal function over an extended period of time. Okay, and it's usually 24 hours a day. So it goes on and on and on. So these are the various CRRT terminologies which you should be knowing. Okay, so there is something called a SCUF where you do only ultrafiltration. So this is for patients with refractory heart failure. Okay, where they really don't have any renal dysfunction also, but because the patient is so volume overloaded, you want to do continuous ultrafiltration alone. Slow continuous ultrafiltration, this is called. Okay, and there are some jargons. Okay, so CVVH, CVVHT, and CVVHDF. So what is the difference? So the difference comes in the circuit which is used. I'll show a few pictures, you'll understand. This is continuous veno-venous hemofiltration. This is continuous veno-venous hemodialysis. This is continuous veno-venous hemodiafiltration. Okay, see, whenever I talk about filtration, it means the principle used is convection. And here you will be having some replacement fluid, because I told you in convection, you have a pressure difference and a large amount of fluid is removed. And with that, some solvent gets dragged out. Because you have this fluid loss, you have to replace this with some other fluid. So in hemofiltration alone, there will be replacement fluid involved. Okay. In dialysis, it's something similar to the dialysis which we have seen. There'll be no separate replacement fluid which is involved. There'll be one dialysate going on and one blood flow going on, and there'll be exchange between these two. When you include filtration with dialysis, it's called as diafiltration. That's all is the difference. Okay, and these are some more terms. So in resource poor settings, like if you don't have any CRRT machine, your patient is having a low blood pressure, you can modify the HT machine to do something called as a SLED, sustained low efficiency dialysis. Okay, so that is given over a period of 8 to 12 hours. The blood flow rate is kept at somewhere around 150, something like that. In the dialysis machine, you can go up to a blood flow rate of 150. Okay, so that's all the difference between HT and SLED. So this is a CRRT circuit. So the dialyzer looks somewhat similar. Okay, you have a blood pump and you have this replacement fluid. So that's the only addition. And in diafiltration, you'll be having dialysate and the effluent. Okay. So, so based on whatever I told you all right now, can anyone tell me what the circuit represents? You can see there is a blood which is flowing. You have replacement fluid. You're also having dialysate.
CVV, HDF.
Very good, very good. So you have both replacement fluid and dialysate. So this becomes CVV HDF. So I'll show you a few circuit pictures, you'll understand. So this is slow continued ultrafiltration. Okay, you have the blood flow and just some amount of fluid is being removed. So this is predominantly in heart failure patients, refractory heart failure patients who are having diuretic resistance and are not responding to diuretics. Then you can use this. Then you have something called a CVVHF, that is continuous veno-venous hemofiltration, where you have this replacement thing going on and the blood going on. This is dialysis. You have the dialysate with the effluent. When you combine both, you have CVV-HDF. Okay, so this is all in an AKI patient, so in an acute kidney injury patient. So now in an ESRD patient, there's something called as hemodiafiltration. Okay, so there are certain studies which say patients who are on long-term hemodialysis, they may do better with something called as hemodiafiltration. Okay, so that is the concept is similar to CVV-HDF, but it's done for a CKD patient. So that's the only difference. So this is hemofiltration, this is hemodiafiltration. So the machine I had shown you is Fresenius 5008S. It is a hemodiafiltration unit. That's the only difference. I'll tell that in the last bit. So this is just a table showing that I told you the blood flow you can go to very minimal levels. Again, the same picture, ultrafiltrate alone. When you have replacement fluid, say there is again something called as pre-dilution, post-dilution. Sorry, I didn't tell that. When the replacement fluid is given before the dialyzer, it is called as pre-dilution. If it is given after the dialyzer, it is called as post-dilution. Okay. So yeah, the replacement fluid can be given either here or over here also. And this is hemodialysis and this is hemodiafiltration. Yeah, so this is how you go about, how do you initiate renal replacement therapy for an AKI person. Again, I'm not going to go too much into the depth. The concepts are similar. I told you about the AEIOU, right? So if you have those indications, the patient is having hypotension, is in an ICU, multi-organ dysfunction, you feel dialysis, intermittent hemodialysis is not possible, you have a CRRT machine in your center, then you can consider CRRT machine. There are no really good studies to suggest that CRRT per se is life-saving or it's a very, very important thing. Something like that is really lacking. But if you have these life-threatening conditions, you have to give the patient some form of renal replacement therapy, and hemodialysis is not possible. And for some reason, if you feel peritoneal dialysis is also not possible, acute PD is also not possible, you can consider CRRT. Okay. And some important thing for catheter-related bloodstream infection. I told you whenever you have a temporary catheter, CRBSI, catheter-related bloodstream infection is the biggest problem. So you should try to make sure you follow all the precautions. These are all the nursing precautions which all of you know. Make sure that you follow all these things to prevent CRBSI. Okay, good hand hygiene, skin preparation using chlorhexidine. Okay, and avoiding keep placing catheter near skin infections. Okay, and make sure you don't let water get in there, or don't ask the patient not to be touching it unnecessarily, and make sure the technician handles the catheter in the right way. Okay, infection prevention, that's very important. And I did tell you about sustained low efficiency dialysis. So let's say your unit doesn't have a CRRT machine, and the patient is having somewhat manageable level of hypotension, and you can do this is a hybrid. This is somewhere in between an intermittent hemodialysis and a CRRT. So you do something called as a SLED, which is a sustained low efficiency dialysis. So usually the intermittent hemodialysis is done for 4 hours. Sustained low efficiency dialysis is done for somewhere around 6 to 8 hours, and even up to 12 hours in some centers. And it's done using conventional hemodialysis. So that is the advantage. And yeah, the advantage is reduced cost. Okay. And the biggest problem with CRRT is anticoagulation, because you have to run the blood for 24 hours outside the body. The blood will clot easily. So they'll need either a regional citrate anticoagulation or heparin. So many times the filter gets clotted, then you have to put in a new filter again, adding to the cost and all those problems. Especially in the papers you would have read, during this COVID pandemic, in the US and all, many of these filters was clotting right, left, and center. Okay. But anyway, yeah. What is this machine? I think we've come to the end. There's 2 more slides. Anyone, what is this machine? No one has seen this machine. So I was talking about a cycler, right? Peritoneal dialysis cycler.
Right, cycler.
Yeah, this is a cycler. This is an automated PD machine. Okay, so tell me, what is this? So this is looking into the future.
Wearable artificial kidney.
Very good. Is this a fanciable belt? No, this is not a fancy belt. So this is VAC. It's a wearable artificial kidney. So we are all eagerly waiting for this. So hopefully this comes into the market, but still it's in the developmental stages. There are many exciting news, but still it's not come into practice. So this is a wearable artificial kidney. So the patient can just wear like this, like a vest. So these are the dialyzers. So this is a miniaturized dialyzer. Okay, so they have developed some various nanotechnology and various methods to redevelop the dialysate and all those things. So some high level stuff is going on. So if you're able to get this, it will be something great for the dialysis patients. Okay, so there's lots of studies which is going on to WAK and stem cell therapy, regenerative medicine, all very in the neonatal stages. Nothing has come into clinical practice as of now. Okay, so again, something called as renal tubular assist device. So many of the dialysis machines, if you see, they do only the work of filtration, right? They do the work of the glomerulus, but not the tubular cells work. Okay, like the secretion of erythropoietin and all those things. So with devices to develop artificial kidney close to that of our natural kidney is all going on. But again, these are all for future. A few lines about what is expected in the future. And this is again from a newspaper article. So this is a wearable artificial kidney which I was talking about. So there's something called as an implantable artificial kidney. So we all talk about a transplant, right? At the end of the day, you want to do really a renal transplant for these ESRD patients. But the biggest problem with transplant is availability of organs. So if you can have these artificial kidneys, which can function like a normal kidney, then it's a win-win for the patient. So lots of studies are going into this as well. But again, all in the early phases, none of them have come into clinical practice. To the end. Yeah, we've come to the end. So this is the last slide. So yeah, I wanted you all to tell that this is the latest generation of hemodialysis machine. So again, brand name, so don't take me wrong. So this is a hemodialysis, hemodiafiltration machine. So most of the hemodialysis machine you would have seen would be the Fresenius 4008S. This is actually the latest 5008S HDF machine. So this is a Baxter CRRT machine. So you have these bags which will be hanging down over here. So many of you have not seen a CRRT machine. So okay, so this is how a CRRT machine looks like. Yeah, there are other company CRRT machines also. You'll have these 4 cyclers. So that's how you differentiate it. Like the Fresenius machine is a bit different. So this is a plasma exchange machine. This is the centrifugal plasma exchange machine. So the nephrology people use the plasma exchange filter and the hemodialysis machine, but this is the centrifugal machine. So this is commonly used in the blood banks. So for that separation and all those stuff. Okay, so this is a centrifugal plasma exchange machine. So in the place where I was trained, the neurology wards and all used to have this machine. Okay, They use it for this GPS and all those stuff. And this is APD machine. This is a cycler, peritoneal dialysis cycler. So this is how it looks like. If you have not seen it, this is how it looks like. So with that, we come to the end. So yeah, this was a primer. Hope you had learned some points from this. Any doubts? Okay. So yeah, I thought I'll finish it by 90 minutes, but I'm sorry I've taken 120 minutes. So I don't want to keep you all further. So enjoy your Sunday. So
Thank you, sir.
bye.
Thank you, sir.